Greetings, traveler. I'm SnapJelly, which is just one word, by the way. I've noticed a significant increase in searches for Snap space Jelly, which results in none of my videos popping up. It's very flattering, but it's kind of sad. So if you want to find my channel, you gotta write it without the space, alright? Keep that in mind. Now, to the point. Dagger fighting. Yes, specifically dagger fighting in RPGs. Usually daggers in RPGs have specific stats, like specific uses that are not really realistic in such a thing, and I wanted to talk about it. Now, one thing that you see on daggers is that they do less damage than swords do. Usually in both tabletop roleplay games or like video games, a dagger doesn't do as much damage as a sword, which is kind of stupid if you think about it. Just grabbing a dagger like this, right? Whoopie-doop. Now, looking at this dagger, right? This dagger is easily large enough to if it's stabbed in my throat, it will reach all the way up to my brain and I'll die, right? And even if it doesn't reach up to my brain, then it'll still cut up all my breathy tubes and blood will pour into my lungs and I'll choke or I'll bleed out. In any case, I'll be dead, right? Stabbed with this. Now, how would that be different from being stabbed in the throat with a sword? You know, it does the same amount of damage. I mean, you could argue that maybe like a swing from a great sword would do greater damage because it will decapitate me, but in both cases, I will just be dead. So does it really matter? It's the same amount of damage. I mean, if I use this the way that you would use a great sword, then of course this is not going to be any good. But if I use a dagger the way you're supposed to use the dagger, then it does the same amount of damage as a great sword. And likewise, stabbing. Like, I'm a fairly skinny guy, but if I get stabbed with this and it goes all the way through, then let's take a look. It'll come out this far. This much will go out of the other end. That's the width of my body. So how much is that? How would that be any different from getting stabbed with a rapier, for example? Right? This is a dedicated stabbing weapon. They are, well, not primarily. Primarily, I mean, you can also cut with these, but mostly stab. And well, you stab with these, and these are incredibly deadly. So why would stabbing somebody with this be more deadly than stabbing somebody with that? It's not. They do the same amount of damage. Now, this depends on if reach is an effective thing in the game that you're playing. Because that's usually what people see, right? Like you have to like take all the characteristics of a specific weapon in consideration. And well, obviously a dagger is shorter than a rapier, so the rapier can reach you before the dagger reaches you. I mean, yes, that is true. But in both cases, if the weapon hits you, you are gonna be dead. So, does a dagger do less damage? I mean, in both cases, you're just gonna be dead. So, or well, if I hit you somewhere with a dagger that you're not going to be dead, then hitting you there with a rapier also means that you're not going to be dead. Now, you could also say that a sword might have a wider blade in general. Right, so a sword and a dagger. The sword obviously has a wider blade, so it makes for a bigger wound. And because of that, you know, it will be deadlier. Because the wound is bigger, so it'll be deadlier. Well, technically a wider wound does more damage, but in both cases, that difference is not going to be that big. In both cases, you are just gonna die. You might die like half a second faster if you get stabbed with this, but it honestly doesn't matter that much. And then you also have to take into consideration, like if I were to stab you with a dagger and you wouldn't die, then me stabbing you in that same spot with a sword would also mean that you wouldn't die. So there shouldn't be any real difference in damage dealt if you're using a dagger rather than a sword. That's one. Another thing that I want to address is speed. Yes, that's usually what you see. It's like the stereotypical view of dagger wielders, like they're thieves or rogues or whatever. They're quick, they're swishy ninja-like, and because daggers are light, right? Daggers are very light, so they are faster by definition, right? Not really. I mean, theoretically, yes. Of course, a lighter thing would be easier to use, but you gotta keep in mind that swords are already incredibly light. I can't repeat that enough. You see, the thing is, swords are light enough for the usage of the sword to be completely dependent, the speed of usage at least, on the strength of your muscles. right? Unless you have some serious like muscle problems, then I can really say anything. But if you're a healthy human being, then you should be able to use a sword to its fullest speed, completely depending on how fast you can move. And well, just to show you, I'm going to show you. Like, here's the dagger, and going from this position to that position as fast as possible. So blocking like a #1 strike. All right, here we go. That's it. That's how fast they can move. Now let's try that with an arming sword. Okay, maybe a little bit more drag there, but nothing really noticeable. Okay, let's try the rapier. Don't fall. Okay, there we go. And no real difference. Let's do a saber. A little bit harder. Maybe it's a bit tip heavy, this one. Again, not really a noticeable difference. Now let's try a long sword, just holding it with one hand, alright? Yeah, there's not really a noticeable difference in speed. I mean, the weapons are a bit heavier, and they create a bit more you know, it's a bit heavier for them to move from one place to another. But that speed difference is, if it's there, it's going to be so small that you can't effectively use that to your benefit in battle. So wielding a dagger is just as fast as wielding a sword, because sword fighting is an incredibly fast business. So again, how does this relate to dagger fighting? Why are daggers faster? They're really not. This only really works if you believe that swords are incredibly slow, and swords are actually incredibly fast, so this doesn't apply. Now at this point you might be thinking, well, if daggers aren't actually faster than swords, then why would you even ever use a dagger? Well, that's quite simple, because daggers are good for certain things, just not per definition speed. You see, daggers are, for one, they're very good complementary weapons. If you have a dagger like this one, kind of parrying dagger. Another name for this is left-hand dagger. Why do people call it a left-hand dagger? Well, because it's predominantly used in your left hand, supporting a rapier. Right? Like this. This is a very common combination and a very effective one. If you use a rapier and a dagger, and as soon as your opponent gets past your rapier and it's trying to stab you with his, you still have a second, well, a shorter, kind of like a very incredibly short rapier here, to be able to still parry that attack. Or you can use your dagger to move your enemy sword out of the way and then thrust with your rapier. So they're very good complementary weapons, that's one. And also the other way around, of course. If you manage to get close, but your rapier is not in place, you can still stab with a dagger. It's like an incredibly small and pointy shield. Another thing is that daggers are short. Well, seems pretty obvious. And a lot of people think by definition that that is a flaw inside it. People think that longer weapons are per definition better, and they're not. Now you might think that, ooh, as soon as you get past the tip of a long weapon, you draw a dagger and you got him. That's also not per definition true. It's quite easy to retract it to a guard position, or if you have a long sword, you can still attack with the guard or with the pommel. There's a lot of things you can do at very close range. So it's not by definition that if you're here in your opponent you have a dagger that you win. But because they're short, they are easy to draw. That's something you have to keep in mind. Now, if you practice quick drawing, this might not apply to you directly, but if you have a dagger that's just short, it has a short blade, so there's not much, you don't have to pull that far before the blade is completely out and you can actually use a dagger. Whereas if you use a sword, if you are in a situation where you have to draw your weapon quickly, then you have to, this takes longer. If you do it quickly, there's a lot more space for you to screw up and start fumbling. If you start yanking this the wrong way, the sword will get stuck and you won't draw it out smoothly. But because daggers are shorter, that's simply harder to do with a dagger. Daggers are really easy to draw. So if you get in a grappling situation, for example, like you're really close up to your opponent and you start grappling and you want to maybe draw your secondary weapon, then having a dagger as a secondary weapon might save your life, because those daggers are very quick to draw, and while your enemy is still fumbling around with drawing his sword, you can already stab him in the face. And as we just established in the beginning, that does just as much damage as stabbing somebody in the face with a sword. So that's one of the good uses of a dagger. And I've also seen people do, in reenactment, I've seen people do this. When they carry a spear, they hold the dagger like this. Now, I'm not really good at this, and I'm not that good with spears. But they hold their spears and dagger like this, right? Their dagger right next to their spear. And this is not as a form of quill on. This is simply because as soon as your opponent passes by the tip of your spear, and you may not be able to retract and go back, then you already have your weapon right here. You have a weapon right here ready to strike. So as soon as your opponent is trying to strike you, you can use your dagger to either block his attacks or attack his arm or whatever is necessary. And, well, that's simply something you cannot do with a sword. I have never been able to do that successfully with a dagger, but I've seen people do it. Now with a sword, yeah, that's... this is not really gonna work. Whoops. That's another potential usage of the dagger. Now lastly, I want to say that if you have a dagger of any kind, because of its length, of its short length, it allows for multiple different things, right? It's not by definition quicker than a sword, but it is more nimble, right? It's easier to move around, and you can, for example, use it in the ice pick grip. Now there's an infamous debate about that, like ice pick grip versus hammer grip, like which one is better. None of them is better, they're just different. But doing this gives you an awful lot of power. It limits your reach, it limits your mobility quite a bit, but it's very good, very handy for piercing armor and things like that. So, yeah, that's something you cannot really do with a sword. I mean, you could hold the sword like this, but it's most likely not going to do you any good. It's not really a handy thing to do. Now, you could say that it's not necessary, but that's an whole other debate. Drawing a dagger is quick, is easy, and you can do it either way, whichever you prefer. You can do all kinds of fun things with a dagger, but they are not weaker than swords, and they're not quicker than swords. So get it out of your brain. Oh, I forgot something. Something that you also have to keep in mind is ease of carrying. Yes, because if you're an ordinary person, like just a normal guy, right? Most of the time you're not going to be wearing full plate armor and not going to carry a sword. It's very easy to carry a dagger, because once more, it is short, so it's very easy to keep by your side and as a self-defense tool. Now, if you get used to using a dagger as a self-defense tool, then after you're going into war, it might be a good idea to use something that you're already familiar with, like a dagger, even though there might be quote-unquote better weapons available, which, I don't completely agree that other weapons are better, but, you could carry a dagger, because if you're used to carrying a dagger and used to using a dagger, then use a dagger. Now, lastly, I do want to say that usage of daggers is in a way limited. Like, people also like to believe, like, with the quick swooshy idea of like a ninja stealthy kind of idea, that usage of daggers, like, if you're specialized in it, then they are just as good as swords. And arguably they are, but usage of daggers is limited in a way. Like, even if you have a dagger like this, which is arguably very, very protective, right? Still, parrying with this, with just this, is going to be way harder than it would be with a sword. Quite simply, and this is already a fairly long one, right? But you're going to have to be more precise with a dagger, because there's less blade. If you screw up with a sword, and you're parrying now, right, and the enemy's blade reaches over here, then it would still hit your sword. Wouldn't be a great parry, but it's still, you still defended it, you still block. But with a dagger, not the case. And also you have to step in further to be able to reach your opponent, and your opponent can also simply step back. So it's not impossible, but it's simply harder. And people like the idea of stealthy people, like just being just as good as other people with short weapons like daggers and swooshy and killing everybody. But in fact, because swords are already so quick, so light, and so light to use, I said light twice. Just using a dagger, I wouldn't really recommend it. You could try it, and you could definitely become very good with daggers. You're still going to be at quite a disadvantage. So what it comes down to, what are the pros and cons of daggers? Well, it's short. That's a pro. And it's short. That's a con. Well, surprise, surprise, the good parts about the weapon also have their downsides. Like with any weapon. Woohoo, surprise. Face reveal at 1 million subs. And also links to all of my social medias are in the description below, with Twitter and Facebook, that is. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye, guys. Bye-bye.